Mhm. 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 Mhm.
I'm going to come listen to it when I heat up my coffee.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Mhm. 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 Um, Good evening. Good evening. Hey, Rob. Nice to see you here. I'm fine. Rob says I'm nervous about what's happening and the idea that Trump. Yeah, I think we're all nervous. Steve Gonzo. Hi. And Dolores Piers, hello to you. And Kay, hi all. And Rob, I'm nervous, and the idea that Trump is talking about having the military go to war against its own people, all in the name of law and order, also known as fascism. Yes, I'm nervous about that too, Rob. Rob said, the way things are now, I'm not even sure what is going to happen in November. This is scary. It is scary, and we're right to be scared. We're right to be scared. They want us to be scared. That's what they want us to be. But we still have to make a fight of it. And I said, did Trump really talk about the bayonets? I don't know. I don't know. It seems to me if he did, that's an impeachable offense. And Mustafa Hajimar says, hi all, hi Mustafa. Dale says, and so we meet again. Good evening, comrades. We'll meet again. Don't know where, don't know when. But I know we'll meet again some sunny day. Sorry, folks. Not in tune tonight. Rob says, I don't get it. Everything that is going, and where the fuck are the Democrats? Where the hell is Bernie? Kay says, shared. Yeah, where the hell is Bernie? What's Bernie been doing? Mustafa Hajimar. Says, hi all. Kay says, shared. And Mustafa says, Trump threatened once before with civil war. And Lana names Christopher Markunis. Okay. Where is Christopher Markunis? Dale says, Vera Lynn has nothing on our Joe. Well, of course. What is she, 103 now? If I can sing as well tonight as she could probably sing now. Rob says, why the hell are the Democrats so goddamn quiet? Sorry for the language, but this is frightening, and the Democrats are nowhere to be found. That just tells me they support Trump and his despicable fascist actions. I think we're going to hear a lot from them because we're hearing a lot from the media types who are going absolutely crazy over this. And the Democrats have to go along with their media types. Otherwise, the media types are not going to fawn over them and tell everybody how courageous they are and how wonderful they are. I mean, hell. With people like by Nicole Wallace fulminating about what Trump is doing, but can the Democrats be far behind? Can they be behind someone who was a refugee from the Bush White House? Lana says, Mr. Markunis is a Marine who had made some important comments on his page today, hoping he will join us here. I'm hoping that he will join us here too. The Marines swear an oath to the Constitution. It seems to me the local police all over the country are blatantly violating the Constitution all the time. I think this is rapidly getting to be bigger than George Floyd. It's getting to be a question of whether we will all of us, sit still for the continuous deprivation of our civil liberties in every city in America. Steve DeVore says, hi all. Kay says, Tom Hartman is calling for another impeachment. Nut. I told him he's dreaming. Well, he may be dreaming, but I'll tell you what, Kay, that's what we have to call for. This guy is acting the part of a fascist, a dictator, but right now, I think that alone is a high crime and misdemeanor. It's a violation of his oath of office. He needs to be impeached right now. Matt says, Joe, it seems we're at a turning point when we might turn toward right towards fascism or left towards socialism. It does not seem that the neoliberal center can hold. But thoughts, well, I wouldn't really necessarily say it's a left turn towards socialism, but okay, I do think that all those who favor democracy, including those neoliberals who are still loyal to democracy, have to choose to stop the fascists from taking over the United States. If this means they have to move a little to the left over a period of time, well, that's what they'll have to do. I think the neoliberal center will have to move, and will have to move towards the left. But whether it goes as far as widespread socialism, I don't know. I really don't think a Medicare for All program is socialism. Okay, I think a Green New Deal is probably somewhat closer to socialism in that the kinds of policies we have to pass for a Green New Deal will involve a greater degree, okay, of socialism, but certainly a greater mix of socialism. But I think under a Green New Deal, the predominance of the economy still will remain a capitalist economy, depending on the content of the Green New Deal. If Bernie Sanders' vision, okay, is realized, and with it a move towards cooperatives in business, okay, in industry, then we'll be seeing a move towards a more socialist America. Of course, that's not very threatening, is it? There's nothing very threatening about good old American cooperatives. I believe cooperative socialism first originated in the United States in the 19th century. Kay says, that is what he said, and I agree, but we have Pelosi. We have Pelosi, but I don't think we're going to have Pelosi for very long. I doubt that she's going to be leading anything in 2021, but not after the way she's acted, and not after the way she has let us down during this crisis. Steve says, when is Congress going to vote this troll out? Are the Republicans really that far up Trump's behind? I don't know. Steve says, hello, peeps. The question is, I suppose, is McConnell, first off, really that far up Trump's behind? I don't know. I think that he is serving McConnell. If he thinks he's going to continue to serve, if Mitch thinks he's going to be continuing to serve a dictator Trump, okay, for very long, he's probably got another think coming, because nobody ever satisfies Donald Trump for very long. Sooner or later, Trump is going to throw him under the bus. And he'll be in a better position to do so if he's a dictator. So if I were Mitch, I'd be watching my back right now, and I'd be running to block Trump from actually taking over. The question is, how many in the cabinet are really loyal to Trump? because the 25th Amendment can be invoked at any time. Bonnie says, hi, everyone. Steve says, shared. Thank you, Steve. Please share widely. Dale says, hey, Bonnie. Steve says, I like the guy running against Pelosi. I can't recall his name right now. Shahed Buttar. Shahed Buttar. I like him too. I think he's going to have a good chance to beat her. I think he's done a pretty good job of fundraising so far. There's been a sufficient amount of fundraising for him to get his message out there. The question is whether he has enough money to sustain the absolute media blitz that's going to come from the Pelosi forces. Matt says, does anyone have a sense of what these protests are manifesting? Is it simply Black Lives Matter and police violence against the Black community, or is it broader and intersecting with other interests like economic inequality? I don't know if it's intersecting with economic inequality quite yet. I think this may be an underlying shall we say, motivation, or there may be an underlying anger due to the degree, of inequality, which is helping people to get out there and helping them to empathize with the movements of justice for blacks. Yes, I think that's there. But I think people haven't begun to be explicit about their economic needs right now, not in the context of these particular protests. I think the first thing they ought to be manifesting, though, is a protest against the violations of their constitutional rights by the police in city after city all over the country. And they also ought to be protesting against what Trump is suggesting, which is basically taking over the country and becoming a dictator. And they have to protest against that right now. And they have to be joined by the police in many, many local areas so that it becomes apparent that Trump will not have widespread support across the country if he goes on with this stuff. Steve says, Shahed is very intelligent. I hope his hair and beard don't freak people. But it's San Francisco, so it shouldn't be a problem. Yes, I hope his hair and beard don't freak people either. I'm sure it's hard enough for them to get past his name. And Kay says, poor people of all colors are pissed off about inequality. I think we are. We are pissed off about inequality. We certainly are. So there was, I received a notification that Jamarl Thomas had a video called Trump Declares Martial Law. And he had me looking around into CNN and other news sources before the show started to see if Donald Trump had made that particular move yet. But he hasn't, so far as I can tell. Haven't heard anything about his declaring martial law yet. There are calls for the resignation of Attorney General Barr because he personally ordered the police assault on peaceful D.C. protesters. There's no argument at all that those protesters here in D.C. were absolutely peaceful. They were in Lafayette Square last night, and the president wanted to take a walk across the street from the White House to an Episcopal church so he could hold up the Bible and make some statements holding the Bible up. I haven't really paid attention to what he was saying then, but for him to do that, the area had to be cleared out. So Barr ordered the police and some of the some National Guard people who were there as well to move people out right in the middle of their exercise of their free speech and free assembly rights. And that doesn't look like something that's not something that is legal, not on order of the president alone. I think that Congress has to be complicit in that, and there was no approval from Congress. And Matt asks, do I think the violence will approach anything like what we saw in the late 60s? Well, I don't know. It depends on how long it goes on and on how many police are involved in continuing to start violence. It's plainly the case that in some of the cities where protests have been going on, that they have been provoking violence. They've been starting violence. They've been enlisting people in helping them with the violence so that there's an excuse for the police to use violence. Steve says, inequality, you ain't seen nothing yet. And Mustafa says, how low the Republican can be to support and protect a fascist president. Well, that's how low they can be. They've been supporting him so far. It's been clear for a long time that he wants to make the transition to fascism. At least I think it's been clear. He's been making a whole series of moves to get to that point. And during this crisis, he's accelerated everything. Kay says the military should refuse to do this. Yes, they should refuse to obey unlawful orders. They've sworn an oath to uphold the Constitution, the same as the president, and that is the highest of their oaths. They owe the Constitution greater loyalty than they owe the commander-in-chief. If the commander-in-chief is violating the Constitution, their duty is to arrest the commander-in-chief and to place him behind bars. Rob Rivera says, I could not believe Nancy Pelosi's response to Trump was to do the same thing. What the hell? Yeah, what the hell? And that doesn't mean much. Steve says, Trump has considered deploying the armed forces here in America, not to the National Guard. That's pretty much that is pretty much a case of martial law. I thought, but that's illegal. Posse comitatus, I believe. Please clarify, Doc. There's certain emergency situations, in case of a rebellion in particular, where it's legal for the president to declare martial law. But I believe in those situations, the president needs the consent of Congress to do that. Now, I think Lincoln did that, and that he did that with the consent of Congress during the Civil War. But for part of the Civil War, at least, there was martial law. Yes. I don't think we've had martial law since, however. It may have been declared by governors in certain state and local situations. It's not only the president who has the right, to declare that, but state and local executives also have the right, to declare martial law. But for a president, to declare martial law, I believe they need the consent, of Congress. Have to look that up again. Steve says, and it was before curfew, and they lit him up again 2 days before curfew. That was where? Wasn't that in California, Steve? Rob says, correction, do the same thing. And Mustafa says, is a military coup possible? It's always possible. It would be very possible if Trump was violating the Constitution. And Dale says, seeing Trump frog marched out would be quite a treat. Quite a treat. It would be quite a treat. Steve says, possible, sorry. Steve DeVore says, I think it's been clear also, and I've been calling him and defending my position for some time. Steve says, a fascist. And Matt says, does anyone know the degree to which the police departments are revenue generators for cities? It varies city by city. And how about for the prison industrial complex? That also varies city by city. But generally speaking, I think they are more important for the prison industrial complex as a source of revenue than they are for the cities. Rick says, evening, everyone. Evening, Rick. And Steve says, D.C., Steve Gonzo. And Steve Wolfbrandt asks for Washington, D.C. No, I don't think they're an important source of revenue for Washington, D.C. I think they're mainly supported by Congress. And Steve DeVore says, I want Nancy Pelosi to charge Trump for treason when his term is up. Is that possible? No. Nancy Pelosi has to impeach Trump. That's the extent of her authority. She doesn't have authority to indict for criminality. So if Trump were to be charged for treason when his term is up, then those charges would have to be made by the Attorney General of the United States at that time. And Case says, hey, Sandy and Rick. And Mustafa Hajamar says, Steve DeVore, I think it's exclamation point. And Robert Marsh says, troops were sent in after Rodney King. All Trump needs is the approval of the governor. Yes, they were sent in after Rodney King. Yeah, but he needs approval. And also, I don't know whether the military was sent in after Rodney King or whether it was the National Guard. Now, I want to distinguish the National Guard being called in by a governor. Okay, that's the National Guard, those contingents, okay, of the National Guard, okay, who are part of a state. What I'm talking about is National Guard troops from all over the country being sent in. I don't know if that occurred after Rodney King. But what I think Trump is trying to do now is to send troops into the various cities in America to put down what he views as a rebellion. In my view, there's no rebellion against the government of the United States. All there is in these various cities are peaceful protests against the local governments and perhaps against the state governments, but there's no rebellion against the federal government that would justify sending in troops. What Trump is saying is that there's authority under the Insurrection Act to send troops into local areas, and the Insurrection Act has been used from time to time. And Trump is trying to claim that this particular situation is an instance, okay, of insurrection. However, I think it's very hard to contend that. And now there are some people who cite the examples of sending federal troops into the South in order to enforce the civil rights laws there. But that's a different thing. The civil rights laws were national in scope. And the protests there by the Southerners were protests that were kind of an insurrection against the federal government. And certainly an insurrection against the idea that the federal government was the supreme law of the land as opposed to state governments. So there was some justification for invoking the Insurrection Act in that particular situation. But no one here is denying that the federal government is able to legislate and enforce the supreme law for the United States. There's no claim like that being made. These are protests against local law enforcement and state law enforcement across the country and how they've been treating blacks. Their protest against the murders of blacks in state after state and city after city by police forces. That is not an insurrection against the government. Rob says, that is why I'm so nervous about what is going to happen. To silence the Democrats on inaction. And according to Jordan Chariton, said, Bernie has been quiet because he's waiting to see what will happen with these task forces. Task forces is right. Sorry, I've lost track of the feed here. Rob says, that is why I'm so nervous about what is going to happen. The silence of the Democrats in action, and according to Jordan Chariton, who said, Bernie has been quiet because he's waiting to see what will happen with these task forces. Oops. I mean, another panel or study. We do not need another study. We all know the solutions. Yeah, They're in Bernie's platform. They're in Bernie's platform. These task forces should copy from Bernie's platform. Rob says Trump cannot be charged for treason. Under treason, we have to be at war, and Trump would have to be conspiring with the enemy. That is true. Now, that is true. For treason, we have to be at war. But Trump could be impeached for violating his oath to the Constitution, and depending on what he does now, depending on what he does now, in terms of certain calls that he might make to ignore the Constitution, he might be charged with insurrection himself. And I think treason does extend to insurrection. That if someone commits a rebellion, against the United States, that it may be possible to try them for treason. But I have to be careful, when I say that. It's been a few months at least since I read that part of the Constitution that deals with treason. But Rob, I think that it would be very hard for him to be charged with treason, because we would have to be at war, and it would have to be shown that he was collaborating with a foreign power to overthrow the government of the United States. Now, there's always Russiagate, of course, but I don't really think anybody has ever proved anything with respect to Russiagate, as far as I've been able to see. They've been very shy about bringing forth the convincing evidence that there's anything at all to Russiagate. Kay says, I think Bernie is waiting for the actual end of the primary to see how many delegates he ends up with. I think in this crisis, there's no excuse for waiting for anything. I think you have to stand tall for democracy in this particular crisis. And if you're Bernie Sanders and you have the voice that he has and the followers that he has, he needs to be declaring himself at this point and stating very clearly which side he's on. Which side are you on, Bernie? Which side are you on? Joanne says, Bernie has spoken up for peaceful resistance. That's fine. But he's also has to speak up against the violation of the constitutional rights of peaceful protesters. Steve says, Bernie's no longer relevant. No longer relevant for you, Steve Wolfbrand. Bernie is still relevant for many of us. Steve DeVore says, treason will never be charged. My hopes and dreams are dashed. Robert Marsh says, yes, both the National Guard and the military was sent in. There have been other times, too. I just can't remember off the top of my head when they were. Yeah, I have the same problem. I can't remember off the top of my head when they were. And Matt says, is there any national coordination among these protests? As far as I can see, all the coordination there is among these protests is being created by the mass media and by the news outlets, informing people of what's going on across the country. And this basically signaling to others that if they oppose the way in which George Floyd was murdered, that they need to get out there in the streets and protest against it as well. And other than that, I think in local areas, people are self-organizing. There's certainly no national coordination by any organization that we are aware of, okay, or know about. Now, trust the Republicans to come up with a conspiracy theory. They're very good at that. For that matter, so are the Dems good at that. But I don't think the Dems are going to do it when it comes to these protests. I think it's going to be the Republicans. Rick says 10 things Dems could do right now if they actually wanted to stop Trump's power grab. The opposition party has significant power to halt the president's authoritarian takeover. They don't use that power right now. They're complicit. And there's an article of David Sirota that is linked to and there's the link. David Sirota is always worth reading. So there it is. And Steve says, I don't think so. And Sunday is here. Hi, Sunday. How are you doing? Sorry, I again lost my thread here. I'll be back to it in a minute. Don't want to overlook any of your comments. Since so many of you are here for discussion, thank you all for coming. Please share this, by the way. Share widely. Steve says, I don't think so. And Joanne says, study Fed MMT basics and join the nonviolent revolution for social and economic justice for all. Absolutely. And Aaron Landcastle says we need to engage in discourse about creating a system of leverage against brutality by the police. These cops are doing their job, but the purchasing power of the American dollar is next to nothing. We're in the beginning of a global economic recession. We may be, but the purchasing power of the dollar is not actually next to nothing. There are people, okay, in the rest of the world still fleeing for cover to U.S. Treasury bills and U.S. Treasury securities, okay, of other kinds. There's been no flag in demand for those things, which means people are not beginning to doubt the American dollar yet. Steve Wolfbrand says, I don't think there's any coordination here in LA. The protests seem to pop up at various locations with no rhyme, okay, or reason. And Joanne Ricardio says, LA has many opportunistic polluters and paid infiltrators, but it's not them who are starting the protests, Joanne. They may be going in after the protests to take advantage, but there's no evidence that the protests themselves are being started by such people. And John Ulazek is saying, former National Guardsman here, would like to mention I would have been fully pissed about being called up to play a dangerous game of chicken with Americans, but during a damn pandemic. I can see your point of view. And having to get up close and personal with the protesters in certain ways. Sonny Daskalea says the president will never do it. Steve says downtown LA seems to have a protest every day. I might head out tomorrow, have a day off. Okay, I'm a little worried about the Rona, though. Yeah, the Rona is difficult. Yeah, Devora is staying home because of the Rona, too. I hope she continues to do so. And Matt says CNBC reported that from 2013 to 19, in 99% of the police killings, there were no charges brought. Yes, I know. How can that be? What are the requirements to bring charges? Now, the requirements to bring charges is that the review boards inside of the police stations generally have to recommend some charges, or the DAs have to be persuaded, in spite of the review boards, to bring charges. And they're usually only brought when there's undeniable evidence that there was a killing, which very likely was an intentional murder by the police. The Eric Garner chokehold case is one of those, of course. Okay, and the current case of George Floyd as well, where it's gone all over the nation. I mean, it's hard to deny that something unlawful happened, and not only something unlawful, but that a killing happened. The question is whether technically and legally it was a murder or not. Joanne says the Black Lives Matter is supposed to be leading the peaceful resistance, but many are not listening to them or following directions. That is true. But they're not actually leading the resistance in all cities, in all places. If people are coming out to engage in protests over this, there are a lot of people who just want to get out there and express their sentiments that this kind of stuff has to stop. After all, it's been going on all over the country, and it's dividing communities, and everybody knows that it's wrong. I mean, look how many communities people are getting out in and protesting. In almost every major city in the country, there's been a protest now. It can't be coordinated by Black Lives Matter. They're just not that successful. Sunday Dascalia says they'll never wage a successful impeachment against Trump. Well, that's not up to them. That's up to the Democrats and the Republicans. And maybe the Republicans at some point will just get fed up with the chaos and realize that the best way to get rid of the chaos, first of all, is to get rid of Donald Trump and get somebody in there who's a lot more calming and appears to be a lot more reasonable and has lots and lots of contacts all over Washington and all over the media, and someone who people think is a person and not some kind of orange ogre. Steve Wolfbrand says almost impossible. Steve Gonzo says, according to multiple reporters who are on the scene of tonight's protests near the White House, Trump apparently wasn't satisfied with his small taste of authoritarianism last night, as protesters are reportedly once again being tear gassed in the streets before curfew. And there's a link to a Political Tribune article. Thank you for the link. Joanne says, draft Sanders and tell Joe to drop out. Steve says, meanwhile, everybody forgot about Epstein and Ghislaine. And Matt says, Bernie has proven that he will follow the DNC orders. Gina Marie says, I will always love Bernie Sanders. Lana says, I agree, Sunday Dascalia. Rich Thurber says, are you saying if state officials refuse to protect citizens, it doesn't become the federal government's responsibility to protect citizens? No, I'm not saying that. I think it does become the responsibility of the federal government to protect citizens, but there are legal ways to do it, and there are ways to do it that are not so legal. And for a president to simply declare that, in his opinion, state officials are refusing to protect the citizens, and the state governors simply say, no, we're protecting the citizens. You're not the person to judge whether we are or not. In that kind of situation, it would be very hard for the president to sustain a martial law declaration. And Rick Maynard said, I was contacted to be a peacekeeper for the BLM rally in March in Manchester, New Hampshire. But this event went smooth until the sit-in at the police station, at which point the police had done everything but march with us. Then a couple of Trumpsters in a black pickup were flying a Confederate flag, started a shouting match with some of the protesters, and the father and son team rolled out with weapons drawn. Then, quick as you can blink, it went from 2 police to 60, and bye-bye Trumpsters. In certain areas of the country, that is what would happen. In certain other areas of the country, it would be bye-bye protesters, I'm afraid. Sunday Dascalia, they would be betraying their own interests. They'll never do it. And she laughs. She laughs and laughs maniacally. And Joanne says, what did Joanne say? Lost the thread again. Damn it. And Sunday says, they would be betraying their own interests. They never do it. And she laughs maniacally. And Joanne Ricardio says, absolutely is the Fed responsibility, but Captain Bone Spurs is a violent and opportunistic racist. Captain Bone Spurs. I haven't heard that one in a long time. Joanne says, protect peaceful protesters and target antagonists and opportunistic looters. Sunday says, hello, sir. And she says, I pop in now and then. Thank you, Sunday, for popping. And Joanne says, gotta go. I'll watch later. And Evelina says, I remember reading a Bernie Sanders post where he condemns the militarization of the police and the silencing of peaceful protests. Yes, he has said that. No, you weren't imagining that. Sunday says, usually watch you from others' watch parties like Lana's or Kathy's. Oh, I see. Thank you. And Rick says, wife just informed me it's time to cook her cheeseburgers. Take care all. Happy wife, happy life. Evelina says, bon appetit. Sunday says he called for the demilitarization of the police. Evelina says, yeah, I thought so. Steve says, the guard here in LA seems pretty cool. The pigs, on the other hand, are vicious. And Sunday Descalia says, I thought so, thank you. Or Evelina says that to Sunday. I thought so, thank you. And Steve says National Guardsmen and protesters were hugging each other in Hollywood today. That's a good sign. I doubt that they would fire on us. Evelina says it's Hollywood. And Sunday says, that's who I meant, Dr. Joe. The Dems will never wage a successful impeachment against the Trump because it's against their interests. It was against their interests. I'm not sure that's the situation any longer. The diversity of the protesters has become impressive, Steve says. Yes, all over the country. Evelina says yes, but isn't in part because people are angry about a lot of things, just asking. It may be, but they haven't started protesting against those things yet. They're protesting, what they're protesting now is George Floyd, okay, and the murders. They haven't started to extend it to other things yet. Maybe they've started to protest when it comes to the violation of their rights by the police in various places. I hope that's true. Steve Wolfbrand says deploying national troops in country is much different on an order of magnitude than a governor calling out the National Guard. It is much different, and it's even different from the president calling out the National Guard. In other words, if you're bringing troops from outside of the United States or from military bases inside of the United States, and you're deploying them for civil enforcement, that's a grave escalation. He says, I think so, Evelina. And Matt says, Trump seems like a privileged, egomaniacal salesman. But do you think he has the ability and desire to be a fascist? Well, I'm not sure what ability it takes to be a fascist. Okay, let's put it this way. He employs a lot of tactics that are fascists, and he behaves like a fascist, okay, in very many ways. Now, he doesn't have the systematic bent, okay, of a Mussolini or somebody like that. I'm not sure he has the ability to plan in the systematic way of the systematic way, okay, of an ideologue who's a fascist. Okay, but of course, he has help. He has help from Bill Barr, who certainly seems to have the ability and the desire to be a fascist. Tina Tuhill Davis says, Evelina, absolutely. And Johnny Uletsik says, at what point does the Pentagon take away the keys to the car? Maybe the 25th Amendment has to be invoked first. And when it's invoked and Trump is replaced as the president by the vice president, then the vice president automatically has the keys to the car. Evelina says the protests may evolve to include other issues people have. I've been hoping they do. Evelina says, no, not yet, Dr. Joe, you're right. Stacey says, but New Yorkers are defying the curfew now, 2 hours past. I think some people in D.C. were defying the curfew too because there was voting in D.C. today, and they were standing online to vote, and they didn't want to go home until they could vote. I don't know what actually developed with that. So, any more comments or questions? Let's see. Other things. I have some more comments now. And Kay says Hitler is the orange idiot's biggest hero. Yes, I know, but I don't think he has the ability of Hitler. Evelina says today the curfew started earlier than last night. Yeah, Bill de Blasio. And John Olazek said, you're going to need a bigger wine glass. Doesn't matter what the size of my wine glass is, but my ration is 1 ounce at this time of night. That's all I do. Steve Wolfbrand said, I saw a line at a gun shop 100 yards long. I know you did. Sandy Degg said, but laugh out loud. Gina Marie says, the last curfew in New York was 1943. And Matt says, do I think Joe Biden will make it all the way to November? I have no idea. I don't have any basis for judging that. Steve says, nurses are going to be down to protest when they get a chance. In New York, they came outside and took a knee as the protesters passed by. Sunday said, we all have to become abolitionists. We need to abolish prisons and rethink a whole value system. And maybe abolish the police too. But black lives will not matter until we address poverty through the many systems of inequality. Absolutely. Anything short of Medicare for all and FJG, coupled with the basic income and baby bonds, is the only ways to address the systemic and systematic oppression of black people. Right. But in addition to those things, the civil liberties and the civil rights, of black people, when getting investigated and arrested by the authorities, must be respected, and when they go to vote, must be respected, and there must be no playing with these rights. So voter suppression has to be made illegal. Evelina says, imagine trying to vote during a curfew. Really putting people through hell. They are. MNA was protesting this past weekend, in Minneapolis. The Minnesota Nurses Association, I take it. Yeah, Minnesota Nurses Association, Gina says. Steve says, when people start getting evicted, the shit will hit the fan. Steve DeVore, that was really cool. The nurses are fantastic. They are. And Brendale Reed says, people know that racism is the key element behind the murder of George Floyd, but no one wants to confront the truth. Why is that? They just don't want to bring it out in the open. I think people are afraid that if they bring it out in the open, there will be a civil war. And Matt says, agree. I think 130K people die each year because of poverty. An absurd number of black children grow up in poverty. The stress of that alone is horrible. Yes, it is. Sunday says, I've been screaming about the black people being executed by cops since at least on 18. The Yuppies in New York City told me repeatedly it's sorry. It's a 1980 fill in number here, but racism doesn't exist. Steve Gonzo says 106,927. That's the fatalities due to COVID-19. And supposedly 76% of those deaths were people of color. 76%. By the way, the 106,927 is okay, that's a number. That seems to be as of 7:40:10 this evening. Oh, that is 7 hours, 40 minutes, and 10 seconds past noon. But the actual total deceased in the overall counter of COVID-19 stats live is 108,048. If so, if that's the truth, and we see that, okay, at the end of the night, that will represent a sudden spike, okay, in the fatality rates per day, in fatalities per day. So where am I now? Steve Wolfbrand says, Kay says, seeing the mess going on here, I almost wish I had brought one of our guns from the house I lost after my hubby died. I used to be a crack shot with a .22 rifle. My dad got me my first one when I was 8 years old. Steve Wolfbrand says, the nurses are the best. And Matt Arado, boy, nurses have a really tough job right now. And Steve says, Doc, how can Floyd and Chauvin have worked at the same club? The odds of that are astronomical. I smell a rat. Yeah, I was wondering about that too, but maybe that was just because there aren't really that many clubs, okay, in Minneapolis. In LA, yeah, the odds of that probably would be astronomical. In New York, they probably would be astronomical too, but maybe in LA, they're not astronomical. And Evelyn asks whether Kay has grown up out in the country. Sunday Descalia says, what? Okay, on martial law. Okay, Wikipedia points out in the United States, it's been declared for a state or other locality under various circumstances, including after a direct foreign attack on Hawaii after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Also, New Orleans during the Battle of New Orleans after a major disaster. Chicago after the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, San Francisco after the earthquake of 1906, and a response to chaos that's associated with protests and mob actions. San Francisco during the 1934 West Coast waterfront strike, and Montgomery, Alabama, following the mob actions against the Freedom Riders. It has also been declared by renegade local leaders seeking to avoid arrest or challenges to their authority. Okay, in Nauvoo, Illinois, by Joseph Smith during the Mormon War, in Illinois. In Utah, by the governor, who was Brigham Young in those days, during the Utah War. I don't know much about the Utah War. The martial law concept in the United States is closely tied with the right of habeas corpus, which is in essence the right to a hearing on lawful imprisonment, or more broadly, the supervision of law enforcement by the judiciary. And the ability to suspend habeas corpus is related to the imposition of martial law. And U.S. Constitution states the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of a rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. There have been many instances of the use of the military within the borders of the United States. This is during the Whiskey Rebellion in the early days of the Republic, and in the South during the Civil Rights Movement. But these acts are not tantamount to a declaration, of martial law. The distinction must be made as clear as that between martial law and military justice. Deployment of troops does not necessarily mean the civil courts cannot function. As the Supreme Court has noted, that is one of the keys to martial law, that the civilian courts cannot function. In United States law, but martial law is limited by several court decisions handed down between the American Civil War and World War II. 1878, Congress passed the Posse Comitatus Act, which forbids the military involvement the involvement of the military in domestic law enforcement without congressional approval. So that's what the Posse Comitatus Act does. It forbids the involvement of the military. So Trump has to seek, unless he can show there's a rebellion, he has to seek the consent of Congress in order to declare martial law or to send the military in to enforce domestic law. I'm sure things are a bit more complicated, than that, but that probably is as good, an overview, as any. So getting back to your comments. Kay says, yes, Evelina, in a 3-acre apple orchard in rural Ohio. Evelina says, lucky you. Steve says, geez, we're after curfew here in LA, but sirens are screaming everywhere. Steve says, for something like 17 years too, I smell something under the surface there too. I can't wait to read that story. Kay says, yes, it was a beautiful property. I was very lucky. Evelina says, was on the freeway. Kay says, my dad also taught me to organic garden there on that property too. Stacy points out the courts are effectively closed due to COVID. That is true. And Steve says he's quoting something from he's quoting Ron Placone, who said there were a lot of inspiring speakers tonight at the Pasadena protest. Then the mayor thanked everybody for coming to the parade. FFS, Black Lives Matter. Pasadena needs a new mayor for coming to the parade. Okay, any more comments or questions? Steve Wilbrand says, I live on a hill overlooking downtown and the 101 freeway. Yes, the freeway, sometimes streets heading downtown. All night long, all day long, sirens and helicopters. Feels like a war zone. I might walk down there tomorrow. Fuck it, Steve says. If you do, Steve, be careful. I hardly need to say that. And maybe Pasta will be down there. Maybe Fiorella too. I think she was arrested just yesterday. However, they weren't able to take her to jail because the jails were full. They were overflowing. They had arrested too many people there. Steve Wolfbrand. Horrible, says Evelina. Kay says, if you go there, be very careful, Steve. And watch your butt, Steve. Now, incidentally, last night here in the D.C. area, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, was walking in battle fatigues down streets, in D.C. He was apparently casing the joint, as they say. Except, of course, usually that term is applied to a criminal. But anyway, he was walking with Donald Trump, the highest-ranking military officer in the United States, is a U.S. Army general, strolling through the streets of the nation's capital, on Monday night, dressed in full combat fatigues. Meanwhile, soldiers and law enforcement officials, some of them on horseback, beat demonstrators with their batons and hurled tear gas canisters into crowds. To clear the path for Donald Trump for his theatrical walk from the White House to St. John's Episcopal Church. And critics denounced the general's participation in Trump's stunt and his subsequent solo appearance in the streets of D.C. as an alarming signal of the military intervention in American cities in response to protests over the police killing George Floyd. The bishop of the Episcopal Church criticized Trump's walk across the street, to the Episcopal Church, basically saying he disapproved the president's, but trying to use the church as a photo op for his stunt. And he said, keep talking, I haven't hit all my groups yet. Low. Oh, I'm sorry. I guess that was a laugh out loud. Sorry. Steve Wolfbrand says, yup, pasta fee, Ron and Graham. But Jimmy stays home, laugh out loud. Yeah, Ron Placone, and Graham Elwood. Now the Los Angeles contingent. And Steve Gonzo says, Elizabeth Warren showed up with her dog Bailey. And what's she doing in Los Angeles? Or was she not in Los Angeles? Maybe she was in Washington. Brandale Reed says, they rather arrest all these people versus arresting the 4 murderers. People are more concerned with looters than murders. Racism at its best. Matt says the more older I get, the more ridiculous these military guys look, all dressed up in their costumes. They look like little children on Halloween. Well, in the case of General Milley, he looks like an overweight a little child on Halloween. Steve Wolfbrand says, and Lawrence Steiner, okay, and Maria Strada, and Keith Anthony Sikora, and Carlos Marroquin, and others, we have a community. Yes, you do. You do have a very nice community out there. I've recently been thinking that there is potential for the three coastal states to be joined perhaps by Arizona, Nevada, okay, and maybe Montana, okay, in secession from the United States to form, okay, a nation of their own. The population on the Pacific coast, okay, is large enough, and that nation would certainly be capable of supporting, okay, a Medicare for All program if their currency was a sovereign currency. If they took care to have their own currency, okay, and their own central bank, and they made it, okay, the sovereign currency, they could have the things that they can't get as states, okay, inside the United States. So if things keep going the way they have been, I think we're probably going to see an expansion of secessionist sentiment out on the West Coast. Steve DeVore says, I saw one girl get trampled by a horse on television yesterday. There was no need for that at all. And Benjamin Dixon says, there was no need for so much, okay, of what they were doing. In Minneapolis, they were using rubber bullets, they were using tear gas for no reason at all. I mean, they were responsible for the violence. They were. In most of the cities across the nation, what violence there is violence that's instigated or that's initiated by the police. It's not violence from the demonstrators. We've been seeing that again and again in city after city. Benjamin Dixon says, remember that for every single citizen that is hit by rubber bullets, beaten with a baton, gassed or trampled, there is a mayor who signed off on it. I'm not sure that's true. I'm not sure that's true anymore. Matt said, I saw that too. There is a ton of egregious brutality by the police all over Twitter. Steve Gonzo says, DC. Steve DeVore says, I'm in the LA contingent. I moved away in 1980. Probably got tired of the smog, right? Steve Wilbrand said, Angelica Duenas, support her. Paula Jean, support her. Yes. I've interviewed Angelica at least twice, I think maybe 3 times. She is a good one. I do support her. I endorse Angelica Duenas. And Paula Jean Swearigan as well. Kay says, in reality, these United States have never really been united. Well, united is a matter of degree. Yes. But there are many countries who have not been entirely united. But China has had trouble with that at various times, okay, in its history. it's a highly regionalized country. Steve DeVore says cops pushing and pulling people down violently for absolutely no reason whatsoever. Cops were the instigators. Steve Wilbrand says, Doc, we almost had Medicare for all, but fucking Anthony Rendon shut it down. If California had had a sovereign currency, it probably would have been easier to get it. Yes, I know Anthony Rendon shut it down. And Anthony Rendon, of course, is a Democrat. Steve Gonzo, I lived in Arizona and San Diego in the early 80s. Loved it back then. Tennis and sunshine. Yes, I figured that was San Diego, Steve. Okay, any other issues, comments, anger, resentments, any other venting? If not, I'm going to finish with the following message. If Trump goes on with this, we'll all have a decision to make, okay, at some point. And that decision, okay, is going to involve whether to have the general strike or not. I think the idea, okay, of a general strike is more and more, okay, more and more attractive. And if Trump keeps up what he's doing, and if the population at large would like to resist it, then during the COVID crisis, a stay-at-home type of general strike of the kind that's advocated, okay, by Eric L. Bloss would be the obvious alternative for us, okay, at that point. It would involve, okay, a minimal danger to people. It would bring things to a halt. It would pressure the Congress, actually do something about all the problems we have. If the messaging were right, it could well mean the impeachment, okay, of Donald Trump. Steve said California is the fifth the largest economy in the world. We could have had Medicare for all. Yes, it was a close thing. There are 40 million people in California. Uh, 39.9 million people, okay, I believe, to be exact. Populations of Oregon, okay, and Washington are somewhat smaller. But between the three states, I'm pretty sure the population totals are higher than Spain and maybe comparable to Italy. Let's find out. 2020 population. About 4.5 million, okay, in Oregon at this point is the estimate. And the population of Washington, States. Is estimated to surpass 7.5 million. So that suggests that we're looking at 12 million between the two states, California 40 million. Then that would bring the three states would have a population of 52 million people. That is greater than the population of Spain right now. It's not quite up to the population, of Italy, but it is certainly getting there. It's somewhat smaller than France and somewhat smaller, than the UK. But it's in the range of those particular European states. Stacy says if something like a California Pacific nation were proposed, I'd have to move there. I imagine a lot of other people would too, probably. Steve Gonzo says a lot of general strike chatter, and Matt asks, who would organize a general strike? What would its aims be? Go to coronastrike.us. And there you can learn about the call for a general strike. That, is Arakel Bloss's site. She's been calling for it. She's been joining with others to begin to organize it. Steve says, support Maria Estrada. She fights for the people and holds corrupt officials' balls to the fire. She is relentless and has no fucks to give. Okay. Evelina says, you could have seceded. I spelled that right. Well, the last group of states that tried to secede, of course, got involved in a civil war with the United States, and they lost. Brendel Reed says, I saw a video of two cops pushing an elderly white man onto his face. He looked to be at least 70 and already walked slowly and with a limp. Before he was even pushed, he looked as if he would just topple over. It was totally uncalled for, unnecessary. But brutality by the police and elderly abuse combined. It was too shameful and so wrong, SMH. Steve said, yup. If something like a California Pacific nation were proposed, I'd have to move there. I imagine a lot of other people would too. Kay says, remember Pacifica? Matt says, thanks. And Kay says, I watched a good online posting from Movement for a People's Party today. I'm sure you did. Okay, I think Nick, has been active. He gave an interview today to the Convo Couch and was interviewed at length by Pasta and Fiorella. Steve says, it's time, Kay. And Kay says, yes, it is, Steve. Evelina says, but just imagine a perfect fissure by running along the border, separating you guys from the continental United States, by not involving any casualties. Of course. Well, there might be a number of other states that would join up. The economic magnet, of the West Coast would be very hard for states like Arizona, for example, to resist, and for Nevada to resist, and probably for Montana and Idaho to resist as well. So there might be a number of other states, that were joining up. The problem with those states is that they're nowhere near as lefty as the three coastal states. Stacey says, I live one county away from D.C. There is a fault around here, though. Oh, yes, there is. So you're living in Frederick County, right? And what's between you and Washington, D.C. Is Montgomery County, right? Steve says, in mythology, California was an island. I'll laugh out loud. Okay, folks. It's 10:38. We've gone through this fairly well. Thank you all for coming. I've gone through all your comments, and I think I'm ready to say goodnight. And I'll see you tomorrow night. Oh, you know your geography, Dr. Joe? Well, that's not too hard. Actually, I am pretty close to Frederick County, because I am in Loudoun County, Virginia, right now. So I'm kind of across the river, and Frederick County is due north up Route 15. In case says, Ali Velshi just turned up back in New York City. He got tired of Minneapolis, huh? Came back with the story. Steve DeVore says, good night, Joe. And Steve says, good night, everyone. Fun show tonight. And Kay says, thank you all for a great discussion. See you tomorrow. And Lana says, good night. And Dolores Pierce says, thank you, good night. And I say, I haven't reminded you of my sites tonight. I'm going to have a better way of doing that soon. But there's my YouTube channel. Please remember my Patreon link, patreon.com, Joe_Firestone. I'm going to have a better way of doing this soon. It's way past the drawing board. It's just in the final stages. And we're going to have some music at the beginning, so it's not silent, okay, when I'm doing my sharing. And I'm going to have a countdown. It's coming up fairly soon. So, coming attractions. Anyway, I'll see you again tomorrow night. I hope. Please come back. Loudoun County, Loudoun. Loudoun County is right next to Fairfax County. And it's not too far from DC. It must be, what, 30 miles, 35 miles from DC. I'm probably closer to DC than Stacy is. Dale Weaver says backup singers would be good too. Yeah, backup singers. No, we don't have any backup singers yet. Steve says, but don't let Bonnie protest the COVID is too dangerous. It's too dangerous for me too. I mean, we both are over 80, you know. And Lana says, okay, I used to live in Frederick. Did you? And how long ago did you live in Frederick? Steve DeVore says, a stone's throw. Sandy says, dancers? No dancers yet. Nana says, very much horse country. We don't see too many horses out here anymore. I think this used to be horse country too, but I think there's still some. Don't get me wrong, there's still some. Stacy says, you probably would not recognize it. I see new stuff every time I go out. Lana says, I would drive over Point of Rocks Bridge. Okay, and then you'd go into Virginia that way and into DC that way. Point of Rocks Bridge. Wow. Anyway, good night, and thanks again for coming.